Hello, welcome to the 2021 Thomas Hardy Society Birthday Lecture. My name is Dr. Jonathan Memel from the Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln, and it's a real pleasure to be giving this lecture this year. If you're joining this online as a recorded lecture, it's likely that you'll be coming through the Thomas Hardy Victorian Fair, which I understand is mostly running online this year. I'm also giving this lecture in the traditional slot in Dorchester on Hardy's birthday weekend itself, so I might well be seeing some of you there. But for this talk I'll be kind of using this newly discovered equipment at home, the equipment that I've been using for my remote university teaching this year. So hopefully that is nearly as good as doing this in person as well. I want to just begin by paying tribute really to as well as Hardy, of course, to Dr. Faisal Muqdadi, who until recently was the academic director of the Society. Many of you will have come across Faisal's work on behalf of the Society, doing some really brilliant workshops and activities and various projects with schools. So I just wanted to mark that and recognise all the hard work that Faisal's put in. So thank you. I'm speaking at a unusual time for all of us, really. We seem to be kind of gradually easing out of lockdown, and I'm not sure about you, but I've found it quite unusual returning to some of the kind of familiar places which are normal parts of my usual routine, which I've been away from for a long time at home. I was thinking about that just in preparing this talk, about kind of going back to Dorchester and seeing some familiar places and familiar people again. And there's a sense of kind of seeing familiar things in a slightly new way, with slightly fresh eyes again. I mentioned that because I think there's a link there to what I want to talk about. So Hardy knew about that kind of sensation really when he returned to Dorchester after having left the area to go and pursue well, first of all to work as a architect's apprentice, and then to take his first steps as a novelist. And it seems that one of his kind of quite generative experiences upon returning to Dorset was this kind of sense of seeing a familiar place with fresh eyes again. It was almost like he was in between two places. There was a sense of belonging to the place that he grew up, but then also of not belonging, of feeling a sense of separation sometimes from the place as well. That's obviously a predicament that we see very often in Hardy's novels, and particularly the novels which come after this kind of return to Dorchester. So clearly we see it in The Return of the Native, which is written around this time when he's returning. But as we're going to be exploring in the talk, we see it in various other novels as well. My subject, as the kind of the short title suggests, is all about education. So just to kind of give you an overall summary before we get stuck in really, I'm going to be exploring a kind of a tension which I've often noticed and reflected and thought about when I read Hardy's novels, which you might well have thought about as well. And that's kind of this slight kind of contradiction or contrast, really. So on the one hand, we have this view of Hardy, don't we, that we get from his biography, if we read about the way he presents himself in the life, which is of as I put in the title, a born bookworm, someone who's a book lover, who read books from a very young age. In many ways a kind of figure of the Victorian period. He made his way up from fairly humble origins to become, by his death, probably the most prominent novelist in the country. There's a kind of a sense of an aspirational idea of education, the kind of sense that kind of knowledge and reading can transform your life in all kinds of ways. So there's that idea on the one hand, and that's kind of certainly the view that we get from the way that perhaps Hardy presents himself. To then a view of education which is quite different, and that's really the one that we get when we look at the novels in particular, and to some extent the poems. And that view of education is rather different. It's one that is really bound up with this theme that I just mentioned about returning, about feeling in between. It's one that very much points out the costs, the drawbacks, some of the losses even of becoming educated, and some of the kind of effects that has on the way that we see and the way that we experience the world. So it's not a wholly negative view of education, but it's one which is got slightly more nuance and much more complexity to it than the wholly positive, aspirational one that I just mentioned. So we'll be kind of keeping those two ideas at play as we proceed then. To begin then, I just want to kind of sketch out that first idea of Hardy as a born bookworm. As I mentioned, that's a quotation from his biography. He calls himself a born bookworm who learnt to read, quote, almost before he could walk. And there's a sense of the very important role that his mother Jemima plays in all of this. She's generally recognised as the key influence upon Hardy as a young boy. She supplied various books. She was an avid reader herself, despite we don't think being able to write particularly well. Quite commonly, those who struggled with writing even would still be able to read. Hardy was kind of exposed to reading at a young age. He also drew all kinds of different influences from elsewhere as well in his life. So the church played an important role, perhaps not so much in a kind of a purely religious sense, but in the sense of the sense of kind of ritual associated with the music that Hardy encountered. Hardy memorised church services and psalms as a young boy. He also tells us, Hardy, that he was, quote, an apt pupil who galloped unconcernedly over the ordinary school lessons. So he's presenting himself as a real bright spark, someone who kind of gallops through school. What were those schools then? Well, at the age of 8, he attended the newly built National School, which is the one that you can see in the slide there, and is still standing today in Bockhampton today, now in private hands, I think. The National School was kind of associated with the Anglican Church. There were a number of national schools being built across the country at this time, all part of this kind of revival of the church and of religion in the middle of the 19th century. There was a sense of wanting to instill kind of religious belief and feeling in the young, and it was thought that schools, particularly schools for younger children, was a good way of doing that. Hardy himself, when he was slightly older and became an architect's apprentice, was involved in that revivalism and worked on many churches and indeed schools to kind of to help supply these new buildings. So that was a kind of a really important first step for Hardy. That was his first experience of formal education. He writes about it. There's a interesting poem he writes called He Revisits His First School, which is all about him returning to this, what we think this building. So where did Hardy go next? So after 2 years at that first school, Hardy transferred. So the first school, the national school, was in Bockhampton, so very locally, in the kind of the rural kind of village environment, very close to his home. He then moved to a school in Dorchester, and rather than being a national school, that was it was what was known as a British school. So this was the other main religious society that was building the kind of school which a kind of upper working, kind of lower middle class boy such as Hardy would go to. He went to Greyhound Yard. This was in Greyhound Yard in Dorchester. The painting there is by a member of the Moule family, Henry Joseph Moule. Watercolour held at the Dorset County Museum, which shows the location of this school. The schoolmaster was called Isaac Last, and by all accounts Hardy got on well here. And he ended up following Last then to another school again when Last broke away and started his own independent commercial school, commercial academy as it was known. So what was Hardy learning? Well, he was really kind of focusing, as school children were then, on what were known as the 3 R's: reading, writing and arithmetic. That was always central to what was known in the 19th century as elementary education. At various points, the government wanted to kind of re-emphasise those 3 core areas. That the idea being that if you left school, you should know those 3 things, not necessarily too much more. Along the way, Hardy, and this is partly to do with Last's kind of enterprise and flair as a teacher, he also gained competency in geography, Latin, drawing, geometry, algebra, applied mathematics, some French and German. So there was a kind of a breadth there which Hardy managed to gain despite the kind of slightly narrower focus of a lot of elementary schooling at that time. It all came to an end at the age of 16, however, when Hardy became apprenticed to an architect, the Dorchester architect John Hicks. And that was just down the road from Greyhound Yard in Dorchester, from the British school there, and also the office, the architect's office, was also just next door to another school run by the dialect poet and I think we can call it educationalist himself, William Barnes. So Hardy moved there. And really, I think we can then see this as the next stage of his education, slightly less formal, but I think an equally important phase. Hardy was obviously kind of undertaking hands-on work with Hicks, learning the trade as an architect's kind of draftsman. But it seemed a kind of a pretty kind of stimulating environment for Hardy. Other colleagues. Kind of stimulating office environment, it seems, with other young colleagues. Someone called Henry Bastow was there, who Hardy kept in contact with. He ended up emigrating to Australia, but when they were working together in Dorchester, they'd have all kinds of conversations and dialogues about religion. Last thing to mention is a local family called the Moules, who lived at this vicarage in Fordington nearby. And Hardy became kind of a visitor to the Moule family, and that was another really important influence, and it exposed Hardy to university education. The various sons in the Moule family were going to university, and through that kind of Hardy became aware of the the kinds of things that you read and learn about at university. So all in all, then it's a real kind of I think if we look at it, it's quite a kind of diverse and stimulating early life that Hardy has. If we think about this in terms of education, one kind of the only real slight kind of qualification really to this idea of Hardy being this born bookworm and kind of avid reader who flourishes from all of this different interaction is the kind of relationship or the comparison he makes to another kind of protege or kind of bright young person in Dorchester at that time called Hooper Talbot. So Hooper Talbot was another kind of protege, another kind of visitor to the Maule family, but Talbot really became a kind of a favourite, really. He became kind of closely coached by Horace Maule and also William Barnes. And partly because of that coaching, Barnes's school had a kind of reputation for preparing students very well for examinations. And examinations were becoming a kind of increasing part of life as they are today. So Talbot was entered in for the what we called the Oxford local examinations, which was a way of kind of students from all backgrounds entering university, and became first in the whole country in 1859. He then repeated that feat a few years later for another examination for the Indian Civil Service. So a remarkable achievement, really, and one that kind of exemplified the a kind of a meritocratic ideal which was becoming quite prominent in the mid-19th century. This idea that whatever your background, however privileged your circumstances that you grew up in or not, if you were intelligent, that could be identified and brought out through testing and through examinations, and then increasingly government and other sectors of work were then willing to allow students who could prove their ability in, as it were. So there's a sense of Hardy responding, in some senses, measuring himself against Talbot. We get that sense from letters that Hardy writes. But I think it does introduce, just early on, this sense of perhaps Hardy seeing himself as someone who doesn't necessarily continue through all that kind of formal education has to offer. He starts to create some sense of kind of critique or critical distance from the kind of institutional forms of education, and starts to kind of identify, and increasingly his writing becomes concerned with kind of other forms of kind of learning, other forms of interest, which are kind of taking place perhaps more informally alongside the more central institutions of the Victorian period. So now thinking about the fiction, we've thought about Hardy's life, and we're now going to think about the fiction and start to think about this more, this kind of other side of the picture, really, and the other side of how Hardy treats education in his work. So the first thing I want to say really is that Hardy doesn't directly tend to write about educational settings directly much in his writing. So if we compare him to earlier Victorian writers, we might think of Dickens or Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, for example. We get some famous scenes of education, Victorian education, in Jane Eyre. In Hardy, we don't really tend to have many such scenes. But what we do much more, what we find much more of in Hardy, is an interest in the kind of outcome of education. So not so much the process of education, but Hardy's novels are much more concerned with the results and the outcome, the effects of education. So it's worth noting something that I've often noticed is the number of characters in Hardy's novels which who come into the novel or begin the stories once their education is complete. We only learn about them as readers once they've kind of finished or completed some form of education elsewhere, and often that's been undertaken somewhere else, away from where they've grown up, somewhere outside of Hardy's Wessex, perhaps, and they re-enter the novel afterwards. That's actually quite an innovative idea of Hardy. So he's working within a kind of a certain form of the novel, which has become quite dominant in the 19th century, which is really centrally concerned with education, and that's the Bildungsroman. Now, just to quickly explain what the Bildungsroman is, it's a German term. I've put up in the slide probably the most famous Bildungsroman by Goethe, and it's translated as often translated as a novel of education, novel of development. They're kind of coming of age stories, and what typically happens is the novel will track the development of one character. In many ways, the novel is about the education of one particular character, and we trace through the story the way that they gain more knowledge about themselves and about the world in which they live. A classic example in British literature might be Great Expectations, for example. So once kind of Hardy becomes a novelist, he's kind of inherited that convention. There would be some expectation, perhaps, that a novel would path a process of a character learning more about the world and becoming more educated. They begin in some slightly kind of innocent state, and then by the end of the novel they've become experienced and they've got self-knowledge and knowledge about themselves. So Hardy does something new. He says, no, I'm not going to follow that same form, that same trajectory. What I'm going to do is reverse that. So I'm going to kind of have some of my most central characters, some of my protagonists, and they're going to enter the novel already in this state of development. They've already been through that coming of age. They've already grown up. They've acquired an education, and that's the starting point for the novel. And it means that Hardy's kind of experimenting with this form of the Bildungsroman, and it means that his novels are then exploring some quite different questions, and they're interested in some quite different processes. And I think really that's what, in the remaining time, I want to explore a little bit more. What happens after these educated characters enter into Hardy's novels. It's important to look at the opening of Hardy's novels for the reasons I've been describing, because they're very much focused on this the kind of perspective that you get from a kind of an educated perspective. So we often meet characters early on in Hardy's novels. We can think of a typical example would be Klim Yeobright, who at the beginning their minds are very full of what they've been taught and what they've acquired through education, and often the narrator, the main perspective of Hardy's novel, the perspective from which the story is told, often kind of picks up some of that and adopts some of that perspective. And so we can kind of pick out a number of openings of Hardy's novels, and what we often get is, this has been commented on quite a lot by various literary critics, which is that the narration is often drawing on different viewpoints of quite specific kind of educated viewpoints. So you might get the view of an artist, or someone who's interested in geography, or, as we see here, the viewpoint of a kind of a tourist, a kind of touring walker. So, in other words, someone who's not, to use the word from one of Hardy's novels, a native, someone from outside, someone who's looking upon Wessex from an outside perspective, with a certain kind of frame of reference, a certain perspective that they're looking upon the scene. This is an example from The Woodlanders. The rambler who, for old association's sake, should trace a forsaken coach road running almost in a meridional line from Bristol to the south shore of England, would find himself during the latter half of his journey in the vicinity of some extensive woodlands interspersed with apple orchards. The use of that term, meridional line, suggests a kind of a perspective of someone who's looking at a map of the area, a quite literate traveller, someone who holds a kind of a wider, kind of educated perspectives, much more so than the kind of the characters who are much more localised in the story. So, in other words, the novel is very much beginning from that perspective. It's the very opposite of a Bildungsroman, where the narrative perspective will often attempt to see the world through a complete innocence of someone who's really not familiar with much at all about the world. They certainly haven't got this kind of very large perspective, educated perspective, as we see in The Woodlanders. So I mentioned Klim just briefly there. He's a quite useful example of this. He obviously is the key character, or one of the key characters in the novel The Return of the Native. He is the native, but he's been away, hasn't he? He's been to be educated in Paris, and he's got this aspiration to return and to be a schoolmaster to the poor and ignorant. He's been inspired by, quote, ethical systems popular at the time, and he wants to, quote, argue upon the possibility of culture. Final quote from him: he has a plan to instill, quote, high knowledge into empty minds without first cramming them with what has to be uncrammed again before true study begins. So he's highly idealistic, and he's confident and very sure that the things that he's learnt elsewhere, away from Wessex, away from the heath, he can bring back the cultural advances of the age. He can bring back, and that will develop and nourish the community which he's from. The twist, of course, in the story is that no one's really particularly interested in what he has to teach, and in some ways that's the tragedy of Klim, is that he doesn't find that vocation that he aspires towards. In fact, the kinds of things that he's interested in teaching about culture and the kinds of knowledge that he's acquired from elsewhere, they don't really seem to have much relevance to those on the heath. Damon Wildeve doesn't see much point in it. We get various characters kind of responding with scepticism to what Klim's trying to do. That's a feature that more and more we look, we see in other Hardy novels as well. That sense of kind of puzzlement at the value of kind of conventional education, or ideas which are deemed to be valued elsewhere, perhaps in London, in the urban centres, are not given the same priority in Wessex. There's often a sense of kind of puzzlement or kind of bafflement. In Jude the Obscure, for example, we see a group of working stonemasons who are slightly confused or bemused by what Jude aspires towards in Christminster. If we think about Grace Melbury in The Woodlanders, she's another example of this Hardy plot, in that she begins the novel with her education complete and she then returns. Grace has been, quote, trained socially and educated intellectually. But again, we find that the things that she's been taught at boarding school don't really have much use in the woodlands, and they haven't really taught her much which can be applied or has much value or relevance to the life that she wants to lead in the woodlands. In fact, what we find is that her education has actually actively diminished some other capacities which she did have before she had left to be educated. So she's no longer really able to kind of appreciate some of the things that she was able to appreciate before. She can no longer distinguish between different types of apple. For, as the narrator says, quote, the knowledge and interest that had formerly moved Grace's mind had quite died away from her. That's something that she becomes increasingly aware of and increasingly resents, the way that education has distanced her from her surroundings and from the people that were dear to her. And at one point in the novel, quite dramatically, she takes her father to task for sending her away to pursue this education, which has really, for her, only caught her, quote, inconveniences and troubles, only brought her inconveniences and troubles. She says to him, I wish you had never, ever thought of educating me. So we do get that sense of education numbing Grace in the Woodlanders and compromising her kind of connection that she had once held to the people and the places around her. But we also do get these glimpses as well, particularly as the novel progresses. I mentioned that the narrator will begin from this outside kind of traditionally kind of educated perspective, but as increasingly we see that Grace is starting to question the value of that kind of point of view, the narrator becomes much more sympathetic to the characters like Giles Winterbourne or Marty South, who have stayed in the woods, and the narrator starts to use kind of language which would normally be reserved for kind of educational words and language to talk about the woodlands. So at one point, a certain area of the woodlands is called the Shady Groves of the Lyceum, and there's a sense that Giles and Marty are able to kind of read the woods, are able to kind of observe and appreciate it in a way that you would with a book. So they've been able to read the books as hieroglyphs, as ordinary writing. They see it as a wondrous world of sap and leaves. And really, kind of my point here is that the novel is itself kind of performing its own form of education upon the reader. So these are these are kind of capacities which the readers might not necessarily have, and we're learning what kind of Giles and Marty possess, which Grace. it's worth noting that the um, the 19th century was a time where there was a sense that the natural world could have a kind of an educational value, and much of this kind of followed the influence of William Wordsworth and kind of the Romantics in the early 19th century, who said, "Let nature be your teacher." So you had commentators such as John Ruskin, for example, who kind of attempted to resurrect this idea, and this is a kind of a quite a kind of an alternative strand of educational thinking in the 19th century to say, for example, the approach which was undergone at the elementary schools of the 3 R's, as I mentioned earlier. This is a form of education which is about developing one's aesthetic taste, one's aesthetic ability, and we should judge someone as educated who perhaps like Marty or Giles, who's able to kind of appreciate and is attuned to kind of beauty wherever they find it, whether in the natural world or in works of art. Okay, so to take stock, we're making our way through the lecture now. We've seen these two sides at work of education in Hardy's life and novels. We've seen the born bookworm. We've seen this aspirational view of education in Victorian Britain, and the way that Hardy experienced that as a young man in Dorchester. And then on the other hand, we've had his fiction, which is kind of critically distant somewhat from that model, which is a bit more questioning of education and the way that it can numb or kind of discolour our experience of the world, as we see, for example, in the Woodlanders. In the remaining time, I want to just really look at this image and a few other similar ones in Hardy's work, which is, and this comes from The Well-Beloved, where we have the two main characters, and we have Avis here weeping, crying whilst she's reading, and the narrator at this point of the story comments on it. The narrator says, quote, "For a schoolgirl, which she virtually was, to weep over a schoolbook was strange." So there's again this kind of tension. Reading, education is supposed to be something which is associated with kind of development, optimism, sense of hope towards the future. But we have this sense of weeping and crying onto the pages of the book, and the narrator asks why. In her book, Our Victorian Education, which I'd very much recommend, Dinah Birch looks at a similar case of tears in Victorian literature, and says that sometimes this kind of sorrow doesn't have an explanation. She says it, quote, "is subject neither to logic nor investigation." But she's interested in these kinds of moments in 19th century literature for the way that they kind of affirm the role of sympathy and emotion, and the way that those kinds of emotions can remain despite forms of education which can be reductive and can be far too focused on facts, and can tend to diminish or actively repress the expression of that emotion. Birch quotes from Tennyson's The Princess, which is a relevant poem for education. It's largely a poem which is very supportive of women's education. But we get this interesting moment which Birch points out. This is the extract. Tears, idle tears, I know not what they mean. Tears from the depth of some divine despair rise in the heart and gather to the eyes, in looking on the happy autumn fields and thinking of the days that are no more. So such glimpses of motion draw their power from not really making much sense. We don't know what they mean, to quote the poem. Tennyson's elegy works by drawing us back to times and states which are very different from the present and the particular priorities of education in the present. And I think Hardy's drawing in that kind of that same kind of mode as Tennyson's elegy. They're both writers interested in loss and looking back. And I think similarly to in The Princess, I think in Well Beloved, that kind of sudden bout of weeping is about this sense of unexplainable, in some senses kind of irrational emergence of feeling and emotion, which has been sidelined by a rigid education, a sense of a kind of a grief lying dormant within a more kind of organised and structured world, which doesn't really take much account for it. Earlier in the Well Beloved is a really relevant novel for education. Earlier on, we get this description from Jocelyn. Jocelyn is known as, quote, a man fresh from towns. He's very much a Klim-like character to begin with, in the sense that he's urbane, he's familiar with the kind of educated environment. He's fascinated by the women that he encounters in Wessex, and he makes this observation of Avis. He observed that every aim of those who had brought her up had been to get her away mentally as far as possible from her natural and individual life as an inhabitant of a peculiar island, to make her as an exact copy of tens of thousands of other people in whose circumstances there was nothing special, distinctive or picturesque. So that poses her education acting against her. It's a form of schooling which makes her into an exact copy, something that enforces a kind of a sense of a generic standard and kind of abstracts her from her the kind of distinctiveness of where she's from. He goes on to say that her education served to teach her to forget all the experiences of her ancestors, to drown the local ballads by songs purchased at the Budmouth fashionable music sellers, and the local vocabulary by a governess tongue of no country at all. I think that's a kind of an intriguing sentence there. The kind of the typical language of learning is inverted, so she is taught to forget. We're usually taught to remember, she is taught to forget. So we see education playing quite a destructive role. It's she's been educated, it's something to prohibit rather than liberate. The verb to drown the drown the local ballads, brings us to think about education as a process of loss, a way of imposing one set of ideas and practices upon another. And you know, in the background there is this sense of her connection to her family background, the local ballads that are mentioned there, this sense of kind of folklore and memory, which the kind of modern education system doesn't seem nuanced or sensitive enough to accommodate, but in fact is actually seems to be kind of actively threatening. I just want to mention somewhat more briefly a second similar instance in the Mayor of Casterbridge. Elizabeth Jane is someone who's also subject to quite a prohibitive kind of hothouse type of education. and her father, Henchard, prohibits her to use dialect as part of that. We're told at one point that her face, quote, reddened with shame and sadness when she mistakenly uses a local word. Again, we have a scene where she's in tears around books, and again, this sense of kind of education and learning being something which is asking the learner to suppress or it kind of threatens something which is dear to them. There resides something in Elizabeth Jane, these kind of latent tendencies in speech, belief, which are tied to her upbringing in a particular place, which are being denied. When learning is born from such a place, when education is about excising the past and replacing it with something which is thought to be better, it becomes a process of loss, and that really comes through in the Mayor of Casterbridge, in Elizabeth Jane, and similarly in The Well-Beloved. And yeah, there's an odd dynamic between Henchard and Elizabeth Jane in terms of Henchard very much wanting Elizabeth Jane to kind of to leave behind her background and to kind of teach her to not use the kind of words and allusions that he himself uses. He kind of transfers a sense of shame for that background onto her. And again in Tess, Tess has a close relationship and connection to her locality, her place, her close relations. But again, we're told that she attends the village school, and again, education is seen as something which is threatening a loss of those kinds of connections. We're told the dialect was on her tongue to some extent, despite the village school. There's a sense of kind of a survival of local custom which is being threatened. There's a particular focus on dialect and language you will have noticed, and it's worth thinking about why Hardy thinks that education is going to threaten dialect and language in this way. Why that focus? I think in order to understand that, we need to make a connection to William Barnes, who I mentioned earlier, who was running that school next to John Hicks's the architect's office. Barnes was a famous advocate of dialect. He was a philologist, so someone fascinated with language, and he throughout his life made various defences of vernacular speech and had some quite intriguing ideas about the importance of dialect and local language. He argued that traditional languages were intimately tied up with one's experiences of and feelings in the world. So he viewed the journey towards modern English as a form of kind of degeneration from a richer and more nuanced version of the language, one in which dialect speech was able to communicate feelings and experiences which were particular to the places where they came from. So he was protective of dialect and language, not only in itself, but because it tied into a particular experience and kind of feeling in the world, which when it was lost would also be lost as well. There wouldn't be the tools to be able to describe them. In one of Hardy's introductions to Barnes's poems, he said that dialect had a quote, a delicate ability to express the doings, joys and jests, trouble, sorrows, needs and sicknesses of life in the rural world. So delicate ability is really important. A sense of language being able to describe an experience which standard English can't. And we get then as well this particular complaint that standardised education, that modern education is going to threaten those particular capacities of dialect and local language. This is a quote which Hardy writes in his obituary to Barnes. He says, "Since his death, education in the west of England, as elsewhere, has gone on with its silent and inevitable effacements, reducing the speech of this country to uniformity, and obliterating every year many a fine old local word." Excuse me. Okay, so I think that's all we've got time for. I've hoped that that's given some sense of the kind of varied meanings education has in Hardy's work and in his life. We've seen Hardy as someone who's greatly benefited from that quite diverse range of educational influences early in his life, something which was enabling for him. And in that sense, he had much in common with lots of other Victorians who the majority learnt to read and write in this period when they may well not have done previously. But then we've also clearly seen very much in Hardy's fiction registering the costs of education as well. I think one of the best pieces of writing on Hardy in general, and particularly on the kinds of topics that we've been exploring today, is by Raymond Williams. I wanted to end by reading a few passages from him. Williams says, "The real Hardy country we soon come to see is that border country so many of us have been living in, between custom and education, between work and ideas, between love of place and an experience of change." Williams goes on, "There was always a great deal in them of an old rural world, old in custom and in memory, but old also in a sense that belongs to the new times of conscious education, the oldness of history and indeed of prehistory, the educated consciousness of the facts of change." So, as we've seen in the lecture today, learning seems to have quite mixed and ambivalent effects. It can rupture one's assured position in the ways and feelings of the past, but it can also bring an increased awareness and appreciation of that past. The figures of young people weeping over books that we've seen just in that final section are evocative as figures of loss, but they also register the attempt to reconcile their thoughts and feelings with a world transforming around them. Thank you.